Encompassing almost half of the Arctic Ocean's coasts, Russia today is one of the foremost powers in the Arctic region. Historically, Russia has been working to conquer Arctic and subarctic regions since as early as the 16th century, beginning with the settlement of Yakutsk in 1632. Economically, Russia relies on the Arctic and subarctic regions for a great deal of its oil, gas, and mineral extraction. The regions contribute to 11% of the country's gross domestic product and 22% of its exports. As such an important regional player, Russia plays a key role in setting the tone for cooperation and competition in the Arctic. Russia's Arctic objectives were clearly set out in its 2008 doctrine entitled The Foundations of the Russian Federation's Policy for the Arctic Zone to 2020 and Beyond. The objectives laid out in this doctrine haven't evolved much over time. They remain relatively stable in their long-term approach despite the changing international context in recent years. Russia's Arctic strategy is rooted in three major objectives. First, on the international stage, Russia hopes to use the Arctic as a region where it can reassert its prestige and status as a great power. It has declared a preference for dialogue and international cooperation in the region, and its military posture is relatively defensive, although it still presents risks of escalation. Second, from a security standpoint, Russia wants to reassert its territorial sovereignty along the borders of the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation. Its objective here is to secure transport routes and prepare for potential threats to sovereignty that could theoretically emerge in places such as the high seas or the continental shelves. Third, domestically, Russia hopes to revive the economic development of the far north through pursuing several major infrastructure projects. These include building new connective railways and pipelines, improving telecommunications and satellite coverage, and working to consolidate a network of military bases and troops specialized for Arctic conditions. Russia aspires to make the 6,000-kilometer Northern Sea Route an international shipping route while still designating it as part of Russia's national waters, a designation which is contested by many countries, including the United States. On paper, the Northeastern Passage can reduce transportation times between Europe and Asia by at least one-third, but the realities are more complex. Unstable weather, fog, icebergs, difficult satellite communication, and inadequate port infrastructure mean that Arctic international transit through the Arctic is still not commercially viable. But domestically, the Northern Sea Route is growing as a route for exporting Russian minerals to Europe and Asia. For years, the Russian government has been split between opening up the Northern Sea Route to foreign ships in order to collect transit fees that could finance new infrastructure and limiting use of the route in the name of national security. Today, the Russian government has prohibited foreign ships from transporting oil, gas, and coal through the Northern Sea Route, with the notable exception of the Russian private gas company Novatek, whose ice-breaking liquid natural gas carriers fly foreign flags. Russia's administrative tightening has been accompanied by new legislation passed in 2019, which requires foreign warships to notify the Russian government of their passage through the route at least 45 days in advance. Moscow's contradictory messages to its foreign partners have hampered Russia's ambitions for a waterway with infrastructure financed predominantly by foreign capital. Even Russia's faithful Chinese partner has complained about the country's changing standards and Russia's dependence upon external funding for infrastructure projects necessary to make the North Sea Route a functional international shipping route.
The Kremlin has two key military priorities in order to ensure sovereignty and protect its national interest in the Arctic. First, Russia has ambitions of control over the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation and beyond. This globally encompasses two trends. The first trend is about protecting the military infrastructure in the Kola Peninsula through what Russia calls the bastion defense concept. The objective here is to ensure perimeter defense of the Kola Peninsula for the survivability of the second strike nuclear assets. The Kola Peninsula hosts about two-thirds of the sea-based deterrent for nuclear second strike capabilities in Russia. Russia therefore seeks to create a hardened, sea denial, and interdiction perimeter around Kola military infrastructure. The second trend relates to perimeter defense over Arctic waters and the sort of new border the Kremlin feels it needs to securitize and protect. Military deployments allow for sovereignty enforcement over Russia's territory and borders in the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation. This is linked to the direct impact of climate change and increased human activity close to Russia's Arctic borders, notably NATO patrols and military exercises. The second key priority is contesting the presence of foreign military assets close to and around the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation. These are ambitions of denial of foreign military activity through the creation of a sea and air denial protective dome in the North Atlantic and in the Pacific. Moscow is increasingly extending its sea denial capabilities towards the choke points of the GI-UK gap, the Greenland, Iceland, and UK gap, and the Greenland, Iceland, Norway, or GIN gap in the North Atlantic, but also around and in the Sea of Okhotsk in the Pacific region. Russia's ambitions here are to disrupt, if not completely deny access to a contested operating environment in both the European Arctic and the Pacific Arctic. This has direct consequences on NATO and its allies in terms of freedom of navigation, as well as uncontested access to a theater of operation. Overall, the Kremlin feels in a relative position of strength in the whole Arctic zone of the Russian Federation, which means that Russia is clearly seeking to obtain dividends from this perceived position of military superiority in the Russian Arctic. Part of this perception has been embodied by the recapitalization of the Northern Fleet. For the past few years, the Northern Fleet has been slowly rebuilding in terms of assets, deployments, and scope of its missions. The Northern Fleet is still very much an aging fleet, but is being gradually re-equipped and modernized with smaller, more adaptable vessels equipped with standoff missile systems. It is important to note that if the Northern Fleet is indeed an Arctic fleet, the majority of its assets are not Arctic specific. The Northern Fleet is today still lacking ice-class vessels, which limits its operational capabilities in Arctic waters. Finally, the Northern Fleet has been turned into the backbone of Russia's brand new command structures of Arctic forces. Starting January 2021, the Arctic region will form a new official military district in Russia.
Russia is facing really important domestic challenges in the development of the Far North. First, at the human level. As a result of its Soviet legacy, Russia is the only Arctic state to have developed such an extensive human and industrial presence above the Arctic Circle. Russia accounts for more than half of the world Arctic population. It has more than 2.5 million people living above the Arctic Circle, to over 4, to which should be added about 10 million people living in subarctic conditions. It has also lost about 1/3 of its Arctic population since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So now we have Russia is facing this kind of contradictory trend, with some cities losing their population, sometimes collapsing by half, while some other cities, especially those linked to oil and gas exploration, have been on the contrary booming. The second challenges Russia is facing in the Arctic is linked to environment. And that's really challenging Russia's territorial coherence and the prospect for economic development of the Far North as a whole. And I will mention here just very briefly several key challenges. First, Russia has to fight against industrial pollution and find ways to improve the environmental situation in the most polluted region, for example, around Norilsk. And the recent oil spill is a good example of the regular mismanagement of industrial pollution and industrial waste by Russian big industrial firms. Then it's very difficult for the country also to manage its territorial unity and its functionality in terms of infrastructure, especially because of the permafrost thawing. A recent study has calculated that around 20% of all industrial and transport infrastructure and more than 50% of residential building will be affected by 2050 because of permafrost thawing at an estimated cost of $250 billion. Third, Russia has to find a way to manage the impact of climate change and especially, but not only, the rise of forest fire due to warmer temperature. So you can see a lot of both human, industrial, and globally environmental challenges that make all long-term prospect of a human and industrial development of Russian Far North very difficult for the Russian government in deciding which kind of strategies is the most legitimate. The situation of the indigenous people is probably the most worrisome. They represent only 5% of the Russia's Arctic population, but their living and health conditions have been clearly deteriorating since the collapse of the Soviet Union because the Soviet welfare system was still offering them more protection than today's neoliberal conditions. And so both climate change and new plans to exploit Arctic subsoil are currently jeopardizing what remains of indigenous traditional way of life. Moreover, Russia is not a signatory of the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, nor of the Indigenous and Tribal People Convention of the International Labour Organization that protects indigenous rights. But there are two new achievements that should be highlighted. First, the Republic of Sakha-Yakutia decided to create an independent expertise committee and to make it compulsory regarding the damage caused by the exploitation of the subsoil. So this decree obliges all extraction companies present on the spot at the Republic level to negotiate financial and material compensation with affected indigenous community even before the installation of any new economic project. Another decision, less important but still that will matter, has been taken by the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous District, which has decided to financially compensate the indigenous community affected by the exploitation of oil and gas, but without giving them any right in participating in the decision-making process itself. So you see that despite this kind of few, quite modest but still noticeable advances, the indigenous people remain the main loser of this new wave of industrial development in Russia's Arctic.